Good morning, everybody. I was down in Huntsville Friday night, yesterday. Friday night I got to go with my family and my grandson. If you want to see pictures later, I'll show you. A little more than 1 year old. We're standing in a long line, the coldest temperature I guess I've had since we had the downtown thing here in the 20s here last week, temperature-wise. But we're standing in line to see Santa Claus. And it was a long line that wound through this outdoor activity into finally when you get up to the house. And I wasn't listening real closely, but my wife clued me in. She said, "Did you hear the little boy behind us?" I said, "No." She goes, "Every step along the way, go, I'm one step closer to Santa Claus." We're one step closer to God. Gathered together here with friends. Some that go back a long way. Some from long distances. Some very new. And we're here together, one step closer. I think that's incredible. That we're going to have that opportunity one day to be gathered together with a larger group of so many acquaintances and friends. And we're going to be right there together. And that's phenomenal. This morning I want to continue our study from sermons on the book of Acts. And we're in Acts chapter 7 today. And I'm just picking out, for those that are visiting, selections that I choose, pieces of sermons or whole sermons, and emphasizing some things that are talked about. And so we're in Acts chapter 7. Just before we get into what Stephen has to say in Acts chapter 7, let's look back and see what God writes to us about Stephen in chapter 6. He's described as he's being chosen among some other men as a man full of faith. Verse 8 describes Stephen being full of faith and power and did great wonders and signs among the people. As he begins to discuss Jesus with some of the Jewish people who are disputing with him, it says in verse 10 that they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. What a phenomenal guy the Lord has in his kingdom. He uses people, and he continues to do so. Good, honest people like you and me to do great things in his kingdom. And now we're going to look at what Stephen did during this time. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the longest recorded sermons in the book of Acts. Now, that doesn't mean it was the longest sermon by any means, but it was the longest one as far as the text-wise goes. Here's what we have written. It's a synopsis of the history of the Jewish nation and how they came about and how they came down to the time of Christ. And I remember when I was younger and I was reading through this just as a brand new Christian, and I was so excited about all the missionary journeys that Paul was going on and the things that Peter did to start the thing going. And then I get to chapter 7, I think, let's just jump over this. Because it's just boring history. And that's what I looked at history. But there's a whole lot more than history here. Though there's a synopsis of the Jewish history, and it's nothing but boring. Nothing at all, but except exciting and powerful, really, is what we're talking about here. And so as we're looking at this message, I want you to see this because it's describing what Stephen says is God's involvement in the lives of people. And that, to me, is why it's exciting. Isaiah chapter 40, before we get into Stephen here. There's a discussion toward the end of that passage that a lot of you are familiar with, where it talks about that we will mount up with wings like eagles, and we'll walk and we'll not be weary and all that. And before you get to that great passage where it tells us how good life is going to be with God and what God is going to do for us, right before that, in Isaiah, there's a section where God speaks out through the mouth of Isaiah. In verse 27, it says, "Why do you think that your way is hidden from me, or that I've forgotten about you?" As God speaking to Israel. And you see, he's talking, Isaiah is, to a group of people that feel like God's left. And yet he's giving them this encouragement about what God is going to do. The fact is, maybe it's not today, Maybe it is today. But many times in your life, you're going to wonder, where's God? And has He left? Is He really involved in my life? Or is this the God that kind of got the ball rolling way back when in Genesis chapter 1, and then He backed up and He's just kind of watched it, and along the way He's done a few things with different people. And I see anything but that, and what Stephen is saying in this chapter is, I want you to see this is an involved God in what's happening. It becomes really, chapter 7, a long list of things that God did along the way for a nation of people who in Christ's time have pretty much just forgotten that God's involved. They're off on their own, they think. They're managing things as the way they think they ought to be doing, and they don't really want God involved in their lives. And we don't need to make the same mistake or mistakes that they made in missing out on what God has done. Verse 2 in chapter 7. As Stephen begins talking, he says, "Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." I want you to focus in on that one little phrase about what God did. Fasten your seatbelts, God's saying. I'm about to do some things here. Now, this isn't the first time that God is involved. He started the ball rolling, as we said, in Genesis chapter 1. He didn't just start the ball. He made the ball out of nothing. Everything of the creation comes from the greatness of God and the power of God, the majesty of God, the wisdom of God, the excellency of God, and on we could talk. And then you move to chapter 3, you find that God is walking with man and woman in the garden. He's not left them. He's got things going, but He's not left them. In chapter 4, after the man and woman have been thrown out of the garden because of their sin, now God is talking to a guy named Cain about a problem that he's got with his brother. And He gives him a discussion, and He tells him what he ought to be doing. So God has not left the scene. And then you move down to chapter 6, and now when the earth is full of sin, and man has forgotten about God, God is still involved. And He's talking to a fellow named Noah. And He says, Noah, I want you to build an ark because we've got to save this world. But you're involved, and I'm going to be leading you, and I'm going to give you the direction. You see, God is involved. And then when you come down to chapter 12, and He calls this man Abraham that now James is starting to talk about. God is the God of glory, and He's still talking to man. You know, probably by this time, you and I say, that's it, I'm sorry, I'm out of here. Y'all go ahead, good luck. But not God. And when we get through here, I want you to see that this is the God that's still involved in your life, in spite of the struggles, in spite of the problems, in spite of the difficulties, the good times and the bad times, the ups and the downs of all of that. God is there. He just doesn't always show Himself. And that's what I want you to see here. But He's not left. Not by any means. Sometimes we wonder about the nation we live in. And some of the things that are going on here that are so disgusting to God. And think, look, I don't blame God for being a little upset about this. And I don't blame Him for leaving. But He hasn't. Not at all. One of the things I think that probably went on was that the people in Jesus' time felt like there's so much time has elapsed since God called Abraham. 1900 plus years, depending on what kind of estimates and calculations you use. But you're talking about a long time ago. And those that are living in the time of Christ or in the time of Stephen just a few years later are listening to all this and they're thinking, I don't remember God really being involved. Way back when, yes, of course, 1900 years ago. What was happening 1900 years ago from here? Barely after the time of Christ's coming. But it seems so far removed that sometimes we make the mistake of saying, well, God's gone now. He's not here. I don't hear Him. I don't see Him. That was a long time ago. I'm so amused by kids, especially when I get a chance occasionally to talk about my Vietnam experience to fifth graders at Boy Buchanan School. Fifth graders, mind you, okay? Some of you hang in there, fifth graders, we'll make it. And so as I go in and they ask me to tell about what was life somebody along the way goes, now was that right there along with World War II, or is that the Confederacy wars? And it's like, no, your timeline's way off. This was not that long ago. And then I stopped thinking of it. No, it was a long time ago. You're right, you know. But they're so far removed, it's like it didn't happen. And sometimes all of those things that we read about in the Bible where God was involved is so far a long time ago that we think, well, now it's not really happening anymore. And that was the mistake, I think, that the Jewish nation was making. And so Stephen gets up and starts talking about this God of glory, verse 2, who appeared to our father. He tells him in verse 3, get out of your country. And then verse 4 it says he moved him. And then verse 5 it says God gave him an inheritance. And then continuing in verse 5, that he promised to give him this. And you see, God is continuing to be involved, not only in Abraham, but he goes on down to the rest of the patriarchs and all the other people that are in this Jewish history, and God is still being involved. God is a God of involvement. 1,000 years ago, what was happening 1,000 years ago? Wow. The Renaissance wasn't even started. Or maybe the rumblings of it. And we think that was so far long ago. But God was doing things then and is doing things now and continues to do things. Think about it this way. Because a lot of us still have that, I don't know if God's doing anything. What were you 2 years ago? I have this discussion sometimes, especially with Christians that haven't been Christians that long. What were you doing 2 years ago? What were you thinking? Where were you working? What was your spiritual life like? Or how about 5 years ago? Or 10 years ago? And along the way you can say, well, I see where God did this or did that or whatever, but now I just don't know that he's quite as involved. Yes, he is. Just because there's a time gap there doesn't mean that he's quit or he's stopped or he doesn't care. But because we hit struggles and difficulties or pains and all these things, we get the feeling, well, God stopped being involved because he's not listening, he's not fixing things, he's not granting my wishes, only Santa Claus will do that, or the genie in the magic lamp, and God's not to be that way. But that doesn't mean that he's not involved, and that he's not working, and that he's not doing some very incredible things, if you'll allow him to do those things. The God of all. As we're coming through here, there's something to notice about this. Think about the church here at Central. We talk about time periods. Where was the church 100 years ago? Well, none of you were here, of course. But we can look back and we can see they were just barely getting started. Well, how about Central just 8 years ago? Where were we? We were struggling. We were having some difficulties. And we were carrying some people some heavy burdens. And you don't have to go that far back to see what God has done and what God continues to do in personal lives, in the life of the church. See, God is involved. And as we think about this coming year, which is just around the corner, boy, I almost wrote 2017 on my check this morning. I was just doing that. Can you imagine? Not quite, but we're almost there. And what's God doing in your life? Number two, I think a mistake they made was silence does not indicate, again, that God's not involved. As the Old Testament closes out, and Malachi, this last prophet, sets his pen down and quits, for 400 years, God was silent. My opinion, and this is just personal feeling, as God kept telling all of his nation what they ought to be doing through all these different prophets for hundreds of years, and they didn't listen. So when Malachi sets the pen down, God says, that's it. I'm not saying anything more. And for 400 years, he doesn't, until Christ's coming. But it doesn't indicate that he wasn't doing something. Because now as we look back and see all the things that were happening, and we read about what what Stephen is particularly saying in this chapter, we see that God was working everything along the way, and maneuvering and swifting and shifting, and all of that was happening because of what God was doing. He just wasn't telling you about it, you see. Silence doesn't indicate that he's not doing something. And when you don't get answers to your prayers, it doesn't mean by that silence I'm still not involved, because he is. So verse 2, the God of glory appears. Verse 4, he moves. Verse 6, he spoke. Verse 8, he gave. And then verse 9, and the patriarchs, becoming envious, he's talking about now Jacob's sons, those 12 patriarchs that having their little battles with one another, these brothers, they sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. Now, if you'd gone up with an interview, CNN pulls up alongside of Joseph and says, "Hey, Joseph, how you doing today?" He says, "Well, I'm on a road as a prisoner down to Egypt. My brothers just sold me off, and I'm not feeling too good. I prayed about it, but God's not answering my prayer. I don't think he's involved anymore." But the reminder keeps coming back that says that God was with him. And when he gets to Egypt and things almost start to look good, then things go bad again, and he gets thrown into prison. And he's there for quite a long time. And is God here or is he not here? And this is exactly, you see, what God's trying to help us to see. You don't always see what's happening. And you have those ups and downs. We have the struggles. We have the deep pains. We have all kinds of issues. And sometimes the worst ones come at holiday seasons. And sometimes they come at whatever times. But God hasn't left us. And that's a whole lot of what Stephen is saying here today. Now, as we look at this, here's some points to think about. Number one, as we said, God's still involved. Not just in other people's lives, but in my life particularly. And I'm so grateful for what God has given me right here with this body of Christians. And the visitors that come through, and the impact, and the mission trips, and all these other things. I couldn't have imagined that 20 years ago. And how God's doing all these things. And the young people that are involved, the kids' classes, and the people that care in this congregation is just so incredible. And how did God do all that? Well, ask me 5 years ago, I'd say, well, we're really in this and that, and I was hoping, and then all of a sudden, here it is. And he's not quit. It was some time ago now, and I was stomping up and down some mountains in a country called Vietnam, carrying a backpack, weapon, ammunition, a whole lot of ammunition, living a lifestyle that most people can't even begin to imagine what it's like. I hadn't forgotten about God, but he wasn't in my mind. And I think of times that I believe God brought me through situations and others not. And I think that was so far long ago. But look at what God has handed us in your last 30, 40 years. As David writes, my cup overflows. God is still involved. Number two, because that is a firm promise and an understanding from that lesson, we've just got to trust in those silent moments, in those hard times, during the difficult situations. And we just keep putting one foot in front of the other because we know we're going to get there. It's just been some cold times that we go through. But we've got to trust that God is there. And sometimes we don't know it, but he's carrying us as we're going through those difficult times. So, number one, he's involved. Number two, we've got to trust. Number 3, be grateful for the things that He's given you. Because look around at the bounteous blessings we have. Just here within our body. And you look across the shores to other nations and the things they've got going on, and oh man. Yeah, I might have some illnesses. But I have some doctors that may be able to take care of a lot better than some other places. And I may not have the friends that I have in some places, but I've got some great ones here. And they're phenomenal, and they care. Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I'm God. I think it's God saying, just calm down. Trust me. Be quiet. I've got this taken care of. The essence of faith, as one person wrote, is letting God be God. Now, He's going to be God regardless if you let Him or not. I understand that. But the thing is, in your life, let Him be God. Let Him be in control. It runs a whole lot better. And then along with that is choose to follow Him. And that's where Stephen is headed in this story as he talks to these people about their Jewish history. And he points out all this. And they're in tune with all that because this is their background. They think everything's great until they get down to the challenge of following Jesus. And they don't want to hear that. And sometimes our world doesn't want to hear that. And sometimes it's hard for us to take that in. But there's a commitment required. And along with that, we then have to size ourselves up with this God who is involved and say, how much am I involved in this? Because if He measured up and put Himself into this, what am I doing? Because we have an incredible God. An incredible God who builds, who strengthens, who takes care of us. The words of Stephen are incredible. He died at the end of that lesson. A martyr's death, being stoned. You think, boy, Stephen, you didn't really get the message across. He got it across. And Luke penned it. And even though he didn't get a response like he thought he did, his message is still the same. God has not left. He cares deeply for each one of us. He knows your hurts, He knows your sorrows, and He's involved in your life. Even though there are silent moments, and even though the time was so long ago where it looks like God was doing things and now He's not, that doesn't mean that He's not. It just means He's got you on pause for a moment because you need to see something, and He'll make you aware of it at the right time. We serve an incredible God. Are you serving Him? Do you trust Him? Are you committed to Him? Are you involved with the people in the church like you ought to be? Because this is part of what God is doing. You know, He didn't just leave us and say, oh, good luck, but He got involved in people's lives. And He expects us to do that, to make sure that we change lives. So how's yours today? Are you serving Him and are you living for Him? Because He came, His Son did, to this earth to die for you. To give you a place. Involvement, yeah. To the highest degree. But He wants the same of us. And if you're not living that, then change today. And if you never committed to Him in baptism, then come today. To a God that cares, to a God that's working things. You may not see it all, but it's happening. Because He cares about you and His church and His people. And He wants you to be part of His plan. Would you come while we stand and sing?